Are your ears getting hot like your president stove? Did your ears get hot like your president stove?
Okay, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, you can say it right.
Oh, I see.
We are going to begin. This is our last segment. Thank you, Greg Schaller, for making time in your busy schedule. A lot of things going on at John Jay, and making time for us is really appreciated. I have, by the way, I hope you don't mind. I'm not trying to preempt anything you're doing. I have an annotated version of the Abolition of Man with all kinds of footnotes to translate the Latin, the Greek, and Italian, French, German, whatever else. If you want a copy, It's just, if it's useful to you. All right. It is very late, but I tried to hand it out last time. There you go. And I can make more copies if you're interested. It helps the reading, I think. This is only for St. John's use. Do not propagate it elsewhere. There you go. Hand one more back. Greg Schaller.
Okay.
Baby, it's all yours.
All right. Now let's get started. So last time we met, we ran out of time. So I want to very quickly summarize the key points of the second chapter and what Lewis is attacking in the Green Book. And a lot of these are kind of a little bit repetitive or just kind of rewording of his argument. But as we talked about a bit last time, the Green Book is itself, according to Lewis, self-contradictory because it's saying there is no absolute truth, yet it's making objective judgments on it. So by saying there is no absolute truth, you're making an objective statement. And so that's obviously an inconsistency, is Lewis's point. He says reason itself is, in fact, value-laden. He says we must therefore extend the word reason to include what our ancestors called practical reasons, or wisdom, ideas of prudence. These are essential, and so these are values, and these are important values, and it's how we organize our lives. It's how we decide to live well together. Third, and again, this is kind of a bit, again, sort of making the same argument a little bit, but he's talking about how the Green Book and others emphasize instinct, but instinct itself has to be evaluated. How do we know whether what we are following instinctually is actually right or not? We are reasoning people. This is something Leo Strauss, another person I had mentioned, said the thing that is unique, sui generis, what is unique about humankind, different from everything else, is that we actually think about and order ourselves in a way. We don't simply operate based upon instincts. Sometimes our instincts aren't good. And Lewis is also pointing out that instincts, not everyone has the same ones. So whose instinct are you going to follow? Do I follow mine or do I follow yours? And again, that demands reason for us to evaluate whether someone's instinct is correct or not. He said again, it's insufficient ultimately in order to, or as a sort of a means of evaluation. Fourth, he says, in order to attack the Tao, you have to use the Tao. You need it because it is, and again, this is very much the objective standard, the idea of value. Value is real. And so he's actually suggesting that the authors of the Green Book, maybe they don't want to admit it, or maybe unknowingly, they're using the Tao in order to critique the Tao. And finally, he makes this point that, according to Lewis, that the Tao develops from within. And what he's saying is that there is, in fact, a progress over time. Not that the human condition has improved, but there's a greater fullness of it. And we can think of examples of Christianity. He says, deepens and fulfills earlier understandings and applications. So we may actually, in fact, have a better, fuller, richer comprehension of the Tao as time goes on. But again, that's not a change in the human condition. The human condition is still fallen. So brief summary of the main points that Lewis was trying to get at in the second chapter. So we'll turn now to the third chapter, titled The Abolition of Man. And before we get in here, Ken actually left me a voicemail last night. He wanted to make a comment on the opening of the third chapter. So it's this quote from Bunyan, and it says, "It came burning hot into my mind, whatever he said and however he flattered, when he got me home to his house, he would sell me for a slave." So Ken, do you want to share?
I just want to mention that quotation of Bunyan made there was also quoted by Lewis in his essay, The Humanitarian Theology, The Humanitarian Theory of Punishment. Let me just tell you, I know for a fact that Lewis had a really hard time being able to find someone who would publish that essay, and the person who decided to take it on was a young man who was the editor of the Australian Journal of Theology. His name was Philip Edgecombe Hughes. He did that in 1949. Later in life, I think starting about 1962, he became the long-term associate rector of St. John's Church. So there's a little bit of a tie between C.S. Lewis and St. John's.
Okay, so the first paragraph, man's conquest of nature is an expression often used to describe the progress of applied science. Man has nature whacked. So what is Lewis observing here? So the world, mid-20th century, thinking about what is happening and observing what appears to be man's progress and his ability to control nature. We'll get into some of the examples that he gives in this text, but let's just take flight. Man's capacity to overcome gravity and to fly. How should we think about that? What should our approach be in thinking about that extraordinary accomplishment?
Fly without any assistance. I mean, basically on the road. I mean, we would just look at that and say, well, that's preposterous. I mean, how can that happen?
So when we achieve it, how do we think about it? How ought we think about it? It's accomplishment, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, is it an awe-inspiring accomplishment?
But think about other things. We have the capacity in this world to feed 8 billion people. It's extraordinary, right?
It's a failure to recognize that it seems to me that it's a failure to recognize that this is derived capacity, that it doesn't come from ourselves solely. And the danger you have up there, danger that technological advancement can mean for fallen man, it seems to me that part of that danger is to create an arrogance that doesn't belong to us.
Okay. What are some other potential dangers in our attempt to control nature?
Not recognizing the positives and negatives of technology.
Okay.
Seeing extremes.
So do we have blind spots, or I mean, are we just inclined to?
I think there are a lot of things that come up and surprise us, often in a bad way, sometimes in a good way.
So I think Lewis wants us to be grounded, and he ultimately wants us to be grounded in the Tao. And if we are not grounded in the Tao, how are we going to evaluate whether this technology is actually good or not, and our use of it, whether or not it's good? So he's warning us about this. We should not be riding this high thinking, oh, we are extraordinary, our capacity to control nature, to tame nature, to have nature whacked. We need to be thinking about it. Is it good? Is it in fact, or is it problematic? There's increasing, Lewis is not saying completely that all technology is neutral. But sometimes it is. It may be an advancement. It may be something that improves the quality of our lives. But ultimately, we need to be confident about this. We need to be certain about this. Is it really an improvement? And then his second really big warning is it's going to be who has authority, power, and maybe wealth, who's going to determine the usage of technology. One of the examples he gives, obviously, is a flight. It's extraordinary. Our grandson lives 1,700 miles away, and we have the capacity to fly there in 3.5 hours to visit him. That's amazing. But somebody also has the power to use that airplane to do incredibly destructive things. Fly it into a building, drop bombs on innocent people. So it's who has the power, who has the authority, who has control of the usage. And Lewis wants us to be very careful about that and warns us about it. Think about it. It may be a neutral thing in a way, or maybe actually sometimes be a good technology, but there may be other ways that it's quite horrific in how it's going to be used. And again, he would say we need the Tao to determine whether its usage is proper or not. Did you have a comment? No. So he gives us these three examples, the airplane, the radio, and the contraceptives. And this may be, maybe seem kind of strange to us that he's pointing out these three things, but the reason he's doing it at this time is obviously connected to National Socialism, to the Nazi movement, and how these technologies were being utilized by Hitler and the Nazis in Germany. So the airplane, using it to bomb London, right? And Lewis obviously thinking this is horrific, that England had not harassed Germany, it had not been offensive towards Germany, it had sought peace with Germany, yet Germany is using this technology to be destructive in bombing London. Through use of the radio waves, control of the radio waves, he's again pointing to Hitler's use of these to promote through propaganda his regime and the efforts that he was taking. And then contraceptives, here it's more specifically about the selective breeding processes that were part of Hitler's regime of trying to create this perfect race of people. In thinking about this, all of these are a controlling of technology, a controlling of nature, and for Lewis, these are obviously for very wicked ends that he's pursuing them. So, man has power. He's gained power over gravity, over radio waves, over fertility. How do we evaluate its usage? And again, he's pointing back to the Tao. We have to have that as what's guiding us, our understanding of the technology and our usage of it. It has to be what is controlling. And what he's observing is that the Tao is in decline. Fewer and fewer people are relying upon this. The authors of the Green Book are saying the Tao doesn't exist. It's going to be instinct that determines what I do, how I operate for some people, or ultimately it's going to be who is wielding the specific power, who's in authority, and they're going to determine this. And, yeah.
You were about to finish that?
No, good.
It seems to me that we see examples of that today. Emotion is more important than thought, and the polarities that we see in our so-called uncivil discourse, maybe a better way to put it, is a result of the fact that people don't actually think through what they're saying. And so in this supposed evolution of humanity towards things that are better, we actually find in our own culture that we're devolving, it seems to me.
That's good.
Just a note, when the comment on over-fertility, back in his novel Childhood's End, which is the basis of 2001: A Space Odyssey and many other things, Arthur C. Clarke has this line, In particular, the pattern of sexual mores, insofar as there ever had been one, had altered radically. It had been virtually shattered by two inventions. The first was a completely reliable oral contraceptive. The second was an equally infallible method, as certain as fingerprinting, of identifying the father of any child. And he acted as if this brought peace to the earth, in a certain sense. And I thought, yeah, right.
Good, good. And again, we'll get to this a little bit later. I think it's Lewis's conclusion that life lived fully is only done within the Tao. And we are trying to operate more and more outside of it as a culture, certainly in the West and other places outside. And we're not bound by it. We don't need to order our lives consistent with it. And the promise is that that's a fuller life, that's a richer life. And Lewis is absolutely rejecting that. It's only within the confines of the Tao that we will have a full, flourishing life.
Do people understand, let me ask real quickly, do people understand the use of this word Tao, T-A-O?
I
No.
confess, I don't.
Okay, good, that's good. It's not good that you don't understand
Well, I
it, it's
missed
good
a
that you,
week, too. I missed a
well,
week.
you've got a lot of nerve.
Yeah,
That's, I mean, so you might want to explain this concept
So,
of
I mean,
Tao.
it's a usage, it's basically the natural law, is what, without calling it that, or God's created order. But it is the order of how we ought to live our lives. So it's saying there's a form, there's an essence of human life, and we ought to conform ourselves to that and not attempt to redefine it. And that fullness of life, human flourishing, eudaimonia, exists within the Tao and conforming our lives to it. And Lewis's concern is that, and this is with the authors of the Green Book, which is in the first chapter of this book, is that they are saying the Tao doesn't exist. There is no such thing as capital T truth of absolute value. Everything is just my, sort of perception of it.
The word Tao is a Chinese word that means way. So there is no single way it's being asserted.
And we as Christians might very likely define the Tao pretty much along the lines of the Ten Commandments. You can see this in his, the way the book ends with its illustrations of the Tao, Ten Commandments, and other like statements.
And
His
the
point is,
appendix
they come from every direction.
Yeah, that these are universal. It's not limited just to like the Christian West, but these have existed throughout all times and all places consistently. All right, so with the collapsing of this, Lewis, again, his concern is it's ultimately going to be who is those who have power. A lot of times it's who has wealth to determine this. And he uses the term, he calls them the conditioners. And what he's getting at is there are going to be people who will be defining the replacement Tao. And they are going to determine how we ought to live our lives and what a well-lived life would look like. And that, he says, is quite concerning. And again, that's going to be somebody who has power and somebody who has wealth. So pausing here for a second, and I don't want to just kind of like bogeymans here and just kind of, but who might we think about today is defining a new Tao and telling people, a population, a culture, to conform themselves to this new Tao?
Yeah, TikTok, that's right.
The party of downloads and the elitists there. I mean, they are a group of.
How is it different? I mean, is there something specific of how it is a redefined Tao?
Well, I just remember hearing John Kerry say rather exuberantly, we are one of a handful of people on the entire earth getting to save the earth. So in other words, in pushing his agenda, he takes great glory in that, the fact that he's in a handful of men that are controlling, and I think it's mostly men, but there could be women in there because they're just as like, but they are controlling the way that people think about climate and how they live their lives and what they should be doing. So they're defining how we should live our lives as it relates to saving the earth. And there are a handful of people that are doing this.
And their agenda is different than one of just good stewardship of God's creation.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. What else? Who are redefining the Tao?
Christians, ostensible Christians. In, for example, the health and wealth gospel, or the kind of militant Christian liberationism that still exists. So the Tao gets used and subtly twisted. It's not a complete tearing up of the Tao, it's a quarter turn.
Any other? How is that redefining?
Well, it shapes the way that we interact with one another, the way that we view the world around us through this lens, triangles of our life.
How about these?
No.
And it's not, I mean, obviously the apps that are on these can be, so whether it's TikTok or something else, but increasingly, this is changing people.
That's taking the place of the wireless.
Our capacity to comprehend, to have a long attention span, it's changing us.
Yeah.
This is, I think increasingly the evidence is this is not neutral technology.
But it's how we also refine that technology for our own purposes, so that we only hear certain voices that we allow speaking to our life, rather than having the marketplace, well, not the marketplace, but the public square where you hear lots of voices, and therefore get siloed from one another.
Mute.
There you go.
All right, Tanner, can you read these two? Like, yeah, the two quotes. No, my screen's messed up and I don't want to turn around.
He can't turn around.
Can't do anything without your
By the way, we welcome 3 of the John J. alumnoids. Great to have them in our midst. It's good to see you guys.
It's good to see you.
Alexandra, Laura, and Tanner.
Yeah.
Can we give them a hand?
I'll tell you quickly, the main reason they're here this weekend is we are starting the second cohort of the John Jay Institute.
Yeah.
And they helped us move furniture and clean this new house for many hours yesterday. So if we can I can barely turn my head at this point. I'm in so much pain. So the two bold quotes, please.
What we call man's power is, in reality, a power possessed by some men, which they may not, or may not, allow other men to profit by. Again, as regards the powers manifested in the aeroplane or the wireless, man is as much as the patient or subject as the possessor, since he is the target both for bombs and for propaganda. But the man molders of the new age will be armed with the powers of an omnicompetent state and irresistible scientific technique. We shall get at last a race of conditioners who really can cut out all posterity in what shape they please.
That's pretty ominous. Who are these people?
Well, the ones to whom we give power in our culture, isn't it, ultimately? Corporately speaking, I mean, not individually necessarily, but look at who's in office, or who will be in office, or could be in office. And I'm not talking about any particular candidate at this point, I'm just saying.
Good, and I want to be careful not to, again, every bogeyman we think is out there. We need to be careful that we may disagree with people on policy preferences, and they're like, that does not mean they are attempting to operate outside the Tao. I think Lewis would caution us against this. Every one of my opponents is not evil. Every one of my opponents is not attempting to reshape the Tao. Some are, though, I think. Do we have the capacity to recognize who these people are and what exactly they're attempting to accomplish. You know, we've talked, I think, the past 2 times we met, you know, about individuals who are attempting to redefine gender. And I think that that would definitely satisfy Lewis's concern of the controllers. These are people in elite places, elite institutions, who are attempting to say that human sexuality, God's design of man and woman, is not the essence, it is not the form. And we can redefine what the form is. And I, as an individual, could redefine for myself what the form is, based upon the activity of the conditioners, who are sort of granting permission for this redefining. And maybe saying the redefining is better than the traditional understanding of human sexuality of male and female.
I don't know if you mind me saying this, but how about Peter Singer of Princeton University, who's seeking to redefine what should be done with those who are elderly and unwell?
Not just that, but also for those who are born with
Defects.
defects. Peter Singer, ironically, he's an ethicist at Princeton University, and he is an advocate of what's known as post-birth abortion, meaning that life does not become meaningful until there's cognitive capacity, and scientists can see that this happens usually 4 to 6 months after birth, where an infant can recognize, if I act a certain way, I will get attention. It's where the point where they recognize that the crying actually gets a response. Feed me or change my diaper. They're doing it instinctually, but at usually 4 to 6 months is when they actually recognize that it gets the reaction that they want. Prior to that time, Singer says life is not meaningful. And a person, an infant born with a defect, it actually, he argues, would be the correct thing to do to terminate that life. And then, as Ken suggests, he's also advocating for similar treatment for people late in life who, because of dementia or something else, it's no longer meaningful life, and the humane thing to do would be to terminate that life. Another irony about this is that Singer's mother is actually dealing with a severe dementia right now, and he's spending lots and lots of money on maintaining her care. So he's not himself actually consistent with the policies he has advocated. Very public. And Singer is actually having an impact. There's a legislator in Australia who's actually advocating very much for passage of post-birth abortion legality in Australia right now. And we're seeing, I think, very much the effects of this with, you know, right to die legislation taking place in many states in our own country, where this is deemed the humane thing to do. Singer is definitely a conditioner. And it may take some time, decades, but we will see the effect of this in our laws. All right, so Lewis discusses the approach of these conditioners of these innovators. On page 61 and 62, he says, the conditioners then are to choose what kind of artificial tau they will, for their own good reasons, produce in the human race. He says, I am not supposing the conditioners to be bad men. They are rather not men in the old sense at all. They are men who have sacrificed their own share in humanity in order to devote themselves to the task of deciding what humanity shall henceforth mean. On page 63. So they are, again, seeking to establish a new Tao. And Lewis, I think, is giving them the benefit of the doubt. They actually think this is for good. But again, Lewis's conclusion is that any attempt to operate outside the Tao will not be a good life. It will not be a flourishing life, and ultimately will have catastrophic ends. And that's the reason that he titles the book The Abolition of Man, and this particular chapter is, this is not the path to good life. It's ultimately the path to our destruction. Laura, can you read it?
If the Tao is the reality within which human life must be lived, it is destructive of one's humanity to claim autonomy over against its maxims. It is, in fact, self-destructive. The picture of an intact and whole moral agent, deciding what principle to adopt, must be given up. The person who tries to stand outside the Tao is not whole. His humanity has been shattered by his refusal to see it in any terms but freedom.
This is Bill professor at Valparaiso University in his study of Lewis. I guess in thinking about this, do we have to check ourselves? Do we ourselves actually attempt to order ourselves outside the Tao in some ways?
I think it's our rebellious nature that tries to go away from God's law, natural law. It's Paul's, I do what I don't want to do, and yet I don't do what I should do, you know, that kind of thing. So I think that's just innate, and yes, there are times that we want to break out of it, and yet we're drawn to come back to it, you hope, at some point, because we recognize that truly is where the freedom exists.
Yeah, I mean, and like the whole sexual revolution was an attempt to operate outside the Tao and to eliminate the consequences for living outside the Tao. So we'll have abortion, so I can, have sex without the consequence of procreation. I will have sex with multiple people, and will find drugs so that I don't suffer the consequences of sexually transmitted diseases. We try and liberate ourselves from the Tao. Does the sexual revolution, does that create a fuller life?
I think that it does, but ultimately, it does not.
Right.
So when most of society is conditioned in this way, how do we reverse this if only a few have this power?
Repeat the question. With volume.
If most of society is conditioned to be outside the Tao, how do we reverse this and reintroduce these values?
I mean, I think there's a sort of a positive and a negative. The negative sort of being we ought to kind of reinforce the consequences of operating outside the Tao and not participate in alleviating those consequences. So let's move from sexuality. Let's just say slothfulness, laziness. There ought to be consequences for people's laziness, failing to be industrious, failing to work hard. And what do? We create, I'm not saying this for everybody, but we create a welfare state that allows for people to not deal with the consequences of that. I'm not saying everybody who's on welfare is slothful, but there are people who are, and we don't allow the consequences to kind of redirect them. We can go back to the sexual issues. We shouldn't make it easy for people to not deal with the consequences of their actions. The positive, I think, ought to be that the church is putting forth a very positive example. If the church was really doing things well, if the people of the church were really doing things well, I'm quite convinced that it would be attractive. And people would say, I want what they have. So I think there's two paths towards trying to impact culture to get society to conform itself to the Tao.
But it seems as though we would have to have social and political power to do so, which we often don't.
Sure. Well, I think in small
Repeat
ways.
the statement, please.
We have to have social and political power to do so, and I feel like we're increasingly losing that today.
I think I would respond to that by saying that the English Reformation, and well, any number of forms of the Reformation in the 16th century, started as grassroots movements, which often reached significant political influence over a period of decades.
I think we have to be also sort of realistic
following that path, that just because we might wield power for a temporary period of time, our ability to significantly reshape culture is going to be very limited. So, which is, you may remember this, in John Jay, we talked about an author by the name of James Davison Hunter. He's a fairly famous sociologist at the University of Virginia. He wrote a book, he's a Christian, he wrote a book called To Change the World. I think in 2009 it was published. It's pretty audacious, to change the world. How are we going to change culture? James Davison Hunter is very much a top-down believer. He says that if you want to shape culture, you have to be at the elite universities, you have to be editor-in-chief of the New York Times, you have to run leading public policy, think tanks. There's some truth to that, but we also can find examples where culture is shaped from the bottom up in local institutions, and this takes a lot of time. But what impact can we have by really impacting a local community through local institutions there and recognizing that this is a generational project?
How did Rodney Stark say that the early church transformed the Mediterranean and spread? Not by power, but by recognizing the resurrection, laying down their lives for those around them.
Yes.
And saying, my life here is just a start. And seeking instead to carry that cross rather than to seek glory and power. When it came, it was a problem.
And we see this right now in our society with people who align themselves, let's say, the far Christian right, who want to use political power to advance that cause, has sadly the negative effect of influencing, let's say, the other liberal side, of feeling coerced, or there's sometimes on the right to do things that aren't attractive. So we have to get back to, as Christians, we have to get back to this reality that change comes from the heart. God does the change by the Holy Spirit. And so pastors everywhere should be just building up their congregations. I think it's the best on, reminding them that they're individuals, and that's what spreads.
It just kind of comes down to attrition, doesn't it? Like, if we're saying that people who act outside the bounds of, like, the Tao are going to implode, right? Because there's consequences to, like, not actually adhering to a natural moral order. Like, there's a deterioration within people, right? Like, people don't even know who they are. They don't even know their own ontology. They're falling apart. They don't have families. They don't have a support system. They're broken. They're depressed. They're sad. That just sounds like a crisis situation. And who are they going to look to? The people that do act within the Tao. And while it's not exactly prosperous or fun to watch everyone fall apart, I think it is about attrition. Can you last long enough to see and reorient people who are broken to look towards something that they could actually ask that question? Why are these groups of people prospering well? It's because, there's a thing called natural law and they appreciate it. So I guess like the cogency doesn't have to come from a place of power on high or like just like lower level like cultural influence, but it's just lasting long enough. And people will come.
Dreyer's book, The Benedict Option, I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's a fun book to read. I don't agree with everything in it. But he says that we really just need to be focusing on right now, political institutions, especially national political institutions, are lost. And we have confused ourselves, we've deluded ourselves for many, many years, conservative Christians. We had great confidence in the moral majority and assuming that Reagan wins and we're going to change culture, and that was foolish. The number of people who actually truly are creedal Christians, we assumed was much larger than it is. It's actually quite small, a percentage of our population. George Barna is a very important pollster of Christians, did a poll, this is probably 15 years ago now, where he broke down the Apostles' Creed and asked self-identified Christians, do you believe in each of these points? I think there was 9 or 10 questions he had. Less than 9% of self-identified Christians agreed with all the components of the creed. I think we're very small. We ought to be realistic about that. So Dreyer's saying, don't look to our national political institutions at all. We need to be focusing on the local church and making that strong, making our families within our local church strong, making their education excellent, and that most likely means homeschooling or Christian education. You can't rely on the local state school any longer. And just making those strong, and then to Tanner's point, when the collapse happens, we will be there, we will be strong, and we will be very attractive to a culture that recognizes that it's gone off the rails.
This is, if I can brag just a little bit about St. John's, this is the goal of things like this. I know that this was somewhat challenging, but nevertheless, being exposed to this kind of information, I think is critical for us as Christians to say, oh, wait a minute, there really are differences, and they're not as subtle as they may sound. And the series that we did on epistemology and evangelism and so on, the goal is to well, prepare for war, if we can call it that, and I'm not talking about a shooting war, I hope, but prepare for the culture war, if you will.
I think one of the things we often forget is we want to win, that we live in a very competitive society. I used to do a little thing in actually Cairn with sociology students, and I used that Barna survey to say, like, we're actually as Christians who believe all these, I went through the 9 steps, and I said, you're actually closer as a minority to the gay minority in the country than you are to just about everybody else. And that was kind of a little, it was provocative, but I wanted people to understand, what you don't assume, and I think that's the big thing. If we assume we're right, yes, we are Christ's in Christ, but the idea that it's all going to work out in the end. The end is home and to glory with Christ as we're further up and further in. That's where we're going, and I think we need to be, mindful that it's, you can't legislate it into being, and you can't. You have to come back to where you're focusing all the time as Christians, because if we lose sight and we look for the power brokering, we lose ourselves to that, because we're taking we're taking the lesser God, in a sense.
All right. So Lewis makes reference to this, as I will, so I command. The actual quote that he's taking this from is, this I will, so I command. Let my will take the place of reason. And the source of this Juvenal, satirist Rome, also has a similar thing. Who will control the controllers? And thinking about that, this again comes back to the power. And Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, on the eve of his election, the papacy, called this the dictatorship of relativism. If we don't have the Tao defining for us and providing that structure, determining the form, determining the essence for us, it does fall again to relativism and to whoever wields particular power. We talked a bit last session about Nietzsche, and this is the will to power. Those who hold that power can determine the structure, the form.
know they're wielding the power? Does it just evolve over time? You know, it's just hard to believe that these things have this master plan. They just, you know what I'm saying? Isn't there already momentum and they're just kind of building on that? How does that happen?
Well, I mean, these are people who are seeking this power, right?
Do they not really know that? I guess they do. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I think for Lewis, I think just thinking in the context of Hitler,
yeah,
there's very much
sure.
a very clear agenda that he possessed. He was seeking power and he was trying to seek the authority to pursue his will. I think maybe some people are kind of blindly going into this, not with evil intent. But I think, at least for Lewis, the context in which he's obviously writing this, it's a very clear example. And for Lewis, he's making the point that what was happening in the German Academy in the late 1800s is directly connected to what happens with the rise of National Socialism and in operating outside the Tao. So, what do you think Lewis would think today? And give me other examples of
cell phones, social media in 1984.
You know, I'm shocked by the eugenics image because I'm looking at the roots. Eugenics is self-direction of human evolution, so it's evolutionary in its presuppositions. Medicine, surgery, psychology, sociology, statistics, genetics, biology. In other words, this theory of human evolution penetrates, well, everywhere.
And this is an image from early 20th century I found online, and this was a celebration. We look at this with absolute, no. Isn't that extraordinary? This is the rise of scientism. And the extraordinary confidence that this is making humanity better.
The Nazis got some of their ideas about social conditioning from Margaret Sanger in the United States. That can be documented.
They also got some of their ideas from the Southern legislators from the U.S.
Sure.
It'd be interesting to do a study on the Amish, because they've always had a kind of a resistance to technology.
Yes, but I think let's not be uncritical of that. I mean, there are things we can celebrate, right? I mean, the fact that we can feed 8 billion people in this world is something to celebrate.
I actually fed artificial intelligence a theological question the other day, and I was surprised how right it got.
I think, like Lewis would again, we need to be careful in thinking about technology and how it may reshape how we're living our lives. And are we certain that's good? Did I give this example? Unless I'm sorry, my John Jay fellows always know this. I had a visiting person lead seminar one time, and he lamented the creation of the washing machine. He did. And his reason, right. But his reason for it was it completely changed local communities. Because there used to be a washing day. And all the women in town would go to the river and wash their clothes together. And it was a way of extraordinary connectiveness within the community. Everybody knew what was going on in everybody else's lives in the town.
Social media.
And it was a good thing. And when that technology came about, those women stopped getting together. They stopped sharing lives together. They stopped, this is what's happening with my kids, this is what's happening, all those things. Now, we all celebrate the washing machine, I think. But what so Lewis would say is, think about how that technology is changing the way you're living, and make sure that you find a substitute to maintain those connections. Don't use it, that time that is free. to do other things that are not conducive towards the maintenance of community. Make sure that you keep those ties together. So that's how I think he would warn us about thinking about technology as to whether or not it's improving our lives or not.
Even the use of time. Yeah. This is a struggle for me as a pastor. We live in a busy culture, and so calling people to spend time in the context of other Christians, well, I want to be sensitive to the fact that we have busy cultures. On the other hand, there are times that maybe we're too busy. And I don't know, most of the time, I'm not sure I know which is which. When is it time to give way and say, no, I understand why you didn't spend time with those Christians. I get that because you're busy. And on the other hand, maybe it's time for me to say, hey, sometimes busy is too busy, and you should have spent time with whatever the activity would have been. It's a struggle. I don't know where the line is.
Well, this is where growing in the Lord gives discernment, right?
Hopefully.
Yeah.
All right. Alex.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, or the long. In the Tao itself, as long as we remain within it, we find the concrete reality in which to participate is to be truly human. The real common will and common reason of humanity, alive and growing like a tree and branching out, as the situation varies, into ever new beauties and dignities of application. How we speak from within the Tao, we can speak of man having power over himself in a sense truly analogous to an individual's self-control. But the moment we step outside and regard the Tao as a mere subjective product, this possibility has disappeared. What is now common to all men is a mere abstract universal, an HCF, highest common factor, and man's conquest of himself means simply the rule of the conditioners over the conditioned human material, the world of post-humanity which, some knowingly and some unknowingly, nearly all men and all nations are at present laboring to produce. You want me to talk about that HCF?
Yeah.
Thing? Yeah, okay. So I read this like a couple weeks ago when we were talking about it. Lewis accidentally messed up because he doesn't know math. The HCF, highest common factor, if you know math, is the highest number of which two numbers can make a, multiply together to make one number. And the least common multiple is the lowest number, that's the same, yeah. Two numbers can multiply together to make one number. Basically, he should have said least common multiple, so saying highest common factor is just like the total opposite of what he meant. But yeah, the abstract universal, yeah, like do you want me to explain it kind of? No, what is that called? Basically we find the lowest common multiple of ourselves that make us human.
Good.
And we should be celebrating our humanity in the Tao and how we are all in alignment with all these things that are God's created order, and it's really deep and it should run everything in our lives, but it's not. We only use the smallest, the least common multiple, the least of our humanity that combined that gives us connection and gives us peace and joy and love in each other. So it's basically talking about how if you are conquering yourself, you lose your humanity, your connection with people, you lose the multiple things that create, the beauty of humanity and the natural law that we live in. Yeah. Basically, right?
Yeah, good.
Okay.
That's good.
Sure.
Good.
Gotta explain math. I didn't.
All right.
Know, but it's fine.
Yeah. So again, just summarizing again, that this is, Lewis is saying this is how we have to conform ourselves, and if we want to have truly good, flourishing lives,
it will be within the Tao. Last thing, and I'll skip over this one. Last thing here quickly. John Finnis, important legal scholar, taught at Oxford, and was actually Robbie George, a student of his, and also Justice Gorsuch was a student of his. He's now at Notre Dame as sort of an emeritus legal scholar. Says the title is not the best thing about the lecture, meaning the abolition of man. The real theme of the lecture was not the abolition of man, but the enslavement of man. the enslavement of man of the conditioners who repudiate the Tao by their own necessarily irrational impulses, and the enslavement of all the rest by the conditions that they have established. So this is the path that Lewis sees, certainly the West, but humanity going down. And the only prevention is the restoration of the Tao. Any thoughts?
How do you restore the Tao?
Question again?
How do you restore the Tao?
Well, the Tao's not going away.
Oh, cool. I mean, but restore, it's like a shared.
Yeah, well, I think this gets back to Laura's point. Is that, were you going to ask the same thing, or?
I was gonna, yeah. So I think as moms with children, and Lewis seems to be really saying like this kind of education is happening in society as a whole.
Yep.
Children is the future of society. What does it look like to make virtue flourish in their lives? No, yeah, in ways that apply to people who aren't in the top classical schools or whatever. What does it look like for us?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's obviously all these levels. It's family, it's education, it's the church. And I think we have a responsibility to not just
give instruction, but to give depth of instruction. And I think we have failed to catechize well young people, to not just say, well, don't do this, but to explain why, and ultimately the positive of it, because doing what is right is the flourishing life. That's happiness. That's true joy. Not, pleasantries, but true joy, even in suffering, and how that can be realized. And we've not done well with that, so that they have a robust defense of it for their own personal lives, but then also as an example to others. So, no, you're right. I mean, this is what Lewis is focusing on. It's families, churches, and education, whatever that institution of education looks like, is essential.
And it's also, like all things, very complex. So not just an intellectual, let me lecture you on these, but it's also
where we started in week one, we were talking about,
habituation of it. I mean, this is a part of catechizing, doing this. We want our children to be generous people. How do we cultivate generosity, and then it becomes a part of their character? And it's through habituation, it's through instruction, it's through them observing, hopefully their families and others close around them exhibiting generosity.
Holy Spirit.
Yes.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
If Satan is the ruler of this world, then the only way that we can fight against that is through the Holy Spirit. So, like, one, is it reasonable to think that we won't have opposition and that we'll have the upper hand in this world? I don't think so. It's only in the church.
There? Yeah.
You want to close this?
You can.
Final comments. Any final comments?
No, I mean, I think, Lewis's observations are
extraordinary. In 1943, I think he's prophetic, and I see continual decline. I see the West certainly continue to move further and further away. So there's reason for a realistic pessimism, I think, yet I do think that if we would focus on inwardly in this season, which is really, I think, what Dreyer points to in the Benedict option, not that we should isolate ourselves, but that we really, in this time, need to be focusing on our families, our local churches, and our local communities, that we will have an impact in at least reversing this somewhat. So,
thank you.
Yep.